Why doesn't a woodpecker's brain turn to jelly? Watch this black woodpecker slam its skull into a tree trunk 20 times a second, hard enough that its skull decelerates at forces that would concuss a human in a single hit. Its eye barely flickers. It doesn't stagger. It doesn't pause. Then another bird joins from the next tree, then another, an entire dawn chorus of skulls hitting wood like hammers on stone. This looks edited, sped up, impossible. It isn't. And the answer everyone gives you for why its brain survives is, according to the scientists who actually measured it, wrong. That everyone includes documentaries, textbooks, and engineers who built helmets around this idea. For decades, the explanation was elegant and satisfying. The woodpecker's skull is a shock absorber. Spongy bone at the front of the skull, a slightly springy connection between beak and brain case, muscles that flex on impact, cushioning built by evolution to protect a brain that takes thousands of jarring hits a day. It's a nice story. It's also, as we'll get to, backwards. But before we get to the twist, we need to understand why the bird is hitting the tree at all, because the danger only makes sense once you see the world the way the bird uses it. A rotting log looks like garbage to us. To a woodpecker, it's a pantry, a nursery, and a billboard, all in the same piece of wood. Beneath the bark, beetle larvae and ant colonies are tunneling through softened fibre, invisible from outside but audible or detectable to a bird that can sense the difference between solid wood and hollowed wood through vibration and sound transmitted up through its own bill. The same trunk that hides food will later hold a nest cavity, chiseled out cell by cell, deep enough that a predator reaching in gets nothing but air and splinters. And in spring, the same trunk becomes a drum. Woodpeckers don't sing across territory the way most birds do, and they don't have the vocal range for it in dense forest. So they turn dead wood into a signal, choosing hollow, resonant branches that carry a drum roll for a quarter mile, announcing this tree, this territory, mine, without opening their beak once. So the destination makes sense. Food, shelter, communication, all wrapped inside a tree trunk. What doesn't make sense is the physics of getting inside it without your head coming apart. And the first answer, the padded skull, sounds like it should close the case. Except there's a problem with it that nobody mentioned in the original theory. Cushioning costs energy. Any material that absorbs shock by flexing or compressing is, by definition, wasting some of the force that was supposed to go into the wood. A woodpecker chiseling out a nest cavity or hunting larvae under bark needs every joule of that impact to go into breaking wood fibre, not into bouncing back through its own skull. A shock-absorbing head would make the bird a worse woodpecker, and evolution does not usually build organs that undermine the one thing an animal depends on for survival. That contradiction sat mostly unexamined for years, repeated in article after article, because nobody had actually measured what a woodpecker's skull does during a real strike. In 2022, a team led by biomechanist Sam van Wassenberg finally did. They filmed 3 species, the black woodpecker, the great spotted woodpecker, and a third species, with high-speed cameras capturing thousands of frames per second, tracking coloured markers glued to the beak, the eye, and the back of the skull. If the skull were absorbing shock the way everyone assumed, the deceleration measured at the back of the skull should be noticeably gentler than the deceleration measured at the tip of the beak, the same way a car's crumple zone slows the impact reaching the passenger compartment. It wasn't. When they compared the numbers, the skull decelerated at essentially the same rate as the beak hitting the wood. No lag, no cushioning, no crumple zone. The bird's head moves as one rigid, unified structure from beak tip to brain case, hitting the tree like a single stiff hammer instead of a padded glove. The shock absorber wasn't doing its job because it was never absorbing shock in the first place. The spongy bone that everyone pointed to as padding turned out, under closer inspection, to serve a different job, holding the skull's shape rigid under repeated stress, not cushioning it. which flips the entire question. If the skull isn't protecting the brain by softening the blow, what is protecting it? And that's where the story stops being about a padded helmet and starts being about scale, timing and geometry. 3 things that don't sound dramatic until you see what they actually do to a brain the size of a chickpea. Start with size. A woodpecker's brain weighs a couple of grams, tucked into a skull barely larger than a thumbnail. Smaller brains, all else equal, tolerate higher decelerations before the tissue starts to shear against itself. The same physics that lets a fly survive slamming into a windshield at a speed that would kill anything larger. Documented decelerations during pecking run from roughly 400 to 6,000 times the force of gravity, compared with a human concussion threshold sitting somewhere around 40 to 110 times the force of gravity. On paper, that gap looks impossible to close. In practice, the woodpecker's brain simply isn't experiencing damage the way a human brain would at those numbers, because the tissue itself, scaled down to that size, is operating in a completely different regime. Then add duration. Each strike lasts a fraction of a millisecond, over almost before the vibration has time to propagate through neural tissue. Brain injury in larger animals often comes not just from peak force, but from how long the brain keeps moving after the skull stops, sloshing inside cerebrospinal fluid and shearing against the skull wall. A woodpecker's brain barely has room to move at all. It sits snugly against the inside of the brain case, wrapped tightly enough, and oriented in a shape flat against the direction of impact, that there's little room left for the brain to slide or rotate independently of the skull. Less room to move means less shearing force on delicate tissue, regardless of how hard the outside of the skull is hitting wood. And here's the detail that makes the earlier obvious feature look almost irrelevant by comparison. Researchers running the numbers on brain cavity pressure found that even without meaningful shock absorption, the pressures generated inside a woodpecker's skull during a real strike stay below the threshold known to cause concussion in a primate brain. The bird doesn't need a cushion. It needs a small, tightly packed, precisely shaped brain sitting inside a skull that refuses to bend, because bending was never the plan. None of this happens by instinct alone, either. Watch a juvenile woodpecker attempt its first real excavation, and you'll see the mismatch immediately. Glancing strikes, poor aim, wasted energy hammering at spots that don't yield. Adult woodpeckers appear to select drumming and excavation sites with far more precision, reading subtle differences in bark texture and internal resonance that inexperienced birds seem to miss entirely. Researchers haven't shown this is taught in any deliberate sense, no evidence of adults demonstrating technique to chicks. But young birds do improve rapidly with repetition, refining aim and force the way any developing motor skill sharpens with practice. What looks like an innate superpower on day one is, at least in part, a skill still being calibrated. That skill matters because the cost of getting it wrong is real. A poorly aimed strike into unyielding healthy wood waste's energy a bird can't easily replace. Foraging for wood-boring insects already burns a large fraction of a woodpecker's daily energy budget, and thousands of strikes a day is not free. There's also a subtler danger sitting a few centimeters from the brain: the eye. Each strike sends a shockwave forward through the skull, directly toward the eyeball, which is exactly where you'd expect an impact injury if nothing were protecting it. A thickened nictitating membrane, a third eyelid, sweeps across the eye a fraction of a second before each strike, acting less like a blink and more like restraint, holding the eye in place against the forward pressure of impact and likely protecting the retina from the kind of shifting that would otherwise blur or damage vision strike after strike. Predators complicate the picture further. A cavity nest is a fortress against snakes and squirrels reaching in from outside, but it's also a trap with exactly one exit, and a woodpecker excavating loudly and rhythmically for hours is broadcasting its exact location the entire time. Hawks track that sound. So does competition. Other cavity nesting birds that can't excavate their own homes will wait, watch, and sometimes simply take over a finished woodpecker nest the moment it's vacated. The same drumming that advertises fitness to a mate advertises location to everything else in the forest that might benefit from knowing where a slow-moving, momentarily distracted bird will be for the next hour. If you assumed the story stopped there, small brain, tight skull, third eyelid, case closed, you would be missing the detail that actually reframes everything. Compare a woodpecker to the helmeted hornbill, a completely unrelated bird on the other side of the world that also slams a solid, heavy structure, its casque, a block of dense keratin on top of its bill, into rivals during aerial jousting contests over fruiting trees. For years, people assumed that casque must contain some kind of internal cushioning too. The same intuitive guess applied to the woodpecker. Researchers studying hornbill skull structure found the opposite. The casque, like the woodpecker's skull, is built to avoid shock-absorbing structures entirely, favouring rigidity that lets the bird hit harder rather than safer. Two unrelated lineages, solving the problem of high-impact collision, independently arrived at the same counterintuitive answer: stiffness over cushioning, because a springy structure would have cost both of them exactly what they needed most. Force transferred efficiently into the target, not wasted inside their own skull. That convergence is the strongest reversal in this whole story, and it is worth sitting with for a second. We keep assuming that surviving violence means softening it. Airbags, helmets, crumple zones, nearly every human safety solution we have built follows that logic. Evolution, twice independently, in two birds that do not share a recent ancestor, built the opposite. Do not cushion the blow, become the kind of structure that does not need cushioning in the first place. The danger was not solved by absorbing it. It was solved by redesigning the entire body around tolerating it, which puts human engineering in an odd position. Woodpecker skulls have genuinely inspired helmet and packaging design for years. Engineers cite the bird explicitly when discussing energy-absorbing materials. The irony is that the biological premise behind that inspiration has now been revised. The bird those helmets were modelled after may not actually be doing what the helmets are trying to do. That doesn't make the engineering useless. A structure can still be a useful design template even if the original explanation for how it works turns out to be incomplete. But it does mean the popular version of the story, printed on museum placards and repeated in nature documentaries for 20 years, needs updating. Sometimes the biggest twist in a nature story isn't a new fact about the animal. It's discovering that the explanation everyone already believed was never properly tested. Human structures complicate the woodpecker's world in less philosophical, more immediate ways too. Utility poles, wooden siding, and hollow metal downspouts all produce that same resonant drumming sound a bird is listening for when it picks a territory marker, and woodpeckers regularly mistake a house's siding for a perfectly good dead branch, drilling through insulation looking for insects that were never there. It's not confusion so much as an old instinct meeting a new material that happens to sound right. Meanwhile, dead and dying trees, the exact resource humans tend to clear away as unsightly or hazardous, are the single resource woodpeckers depend on most, for food, nesting and drumming alike. A tidy park with no standing deadwood is, from a woodpecker's perspective, a neighbourhood with no pantries and no houses for rent, regardless of how many live, healthy trees are still standing. So go back to that first image, the black woodpecker driving its skull into a trunk over and over. A bird apparently daring its own brain to fail and getting away with it thousands of times a day. It isn't getting away with anything. There was never a padded skull absorbing violence on its brain's behalf. There is a small brain packed tightly into a rigid, unyielding structure engineered to transmit force outward rather than let any of it come back in, timed down to fractions of a millisecond, protected at the eye by a membrane doing exactly the job it needs to do and nothing more. The recklessness you thought you were watching was never reckless. It was one of the most precisely tuned collision systems in the animal kingdom. Running on hardware evolution has been refining since long before anyone built a helmet and pointed to this bird as the reason why. By the time the sun is fully up, the drumming has stopped. The same bird that spent the morning slamming its skull into solid wood at forces that would floor a human is now quietly working a loose flap of bark with its tongue, picking out a larva, entirely unaware that anything it just did should have been impossible. It never knew there was a mystery here at all. It was just looking for breakfast.